The scent of honeysuckle, usually a sweet balm on a humid summer evening, had turned cloying, almost suffocating, ever since Brenda Henderson had decided to wage her war. It clung to the air around her meticulously manicured patch of petunias and impatience, a fragrant banner of her self-appointed reign over Sycamore Creek estates. For me, however, it was the smell of impending doom, the fragrant harbinger of a bureaucratic nightmare. My mailbox, a stout, unassuming black metal box perched on a sturdy post at the edge of my driveway, was my lifeline. It was where I received bills, the occasional postcard from my sister in Arizona, and most importantly, the flyers from the local Italian restaurant that advertised their weekly specials. Small pleasures, perhaps, but in the grand scheme of things, they were the threads that kept my mundane life from unraveling. Now, that lifeline was severed. It started subtly, as these things often do. A perfectly placed, vibrantly colored plastic flamingo, its beady eyes staring accusingly, appeared one Tuesday morning, strategically positioned to nudge against the base of my mailbox post. I'd chuckled, assuming a neighborly prank, and nudged it back with my foot. But the flamingo returned, and then another, and another, until a small, garish flock was congregating around my mailbox, effectively creating a visual and physical barrier. I should have known. Brenda Henderson, the self-anointed matriarch of Sycamore Creek Estates, was not one for subtle gestures. Her domain was the pristine, the orderly, the meticulously controlled. Her own front yard was a testament to this obsession. A geometrically perfect lawn, flower beds edged with military precision, and not a single weed daring to sprout. She viewed any deviation from her aesthetic as a personal affront, a blight on the otherwise flawless tapestry of our neighborhood. My floral enthusiasm, it seemed, was that blight. I loved my flowers. I loved the riot of color, the gentle sway of the blooms in the breeze, the way they attracted buzzing bees and fluttering butterflies. My front garden wasn't a manicured museum. It was a living, breathing explosion of life. And apparently, a portion of that life had dared to extend its tendrils a little too far for Brenda's liking. The offending culprits, in Brenda's eyes, were my climbing roses. They were a deep, velvety crimson, their thorny vines weaving an intricate lattice up a trellis I'd installed near the driveway. They were magnificent, their scent a rich perfume that I adored. But a few stray branches, spurred on by an unusually wet spring and a healthy dose of sunshine, had indeed begun to creep outwards, their delicate leaves brushing against the very edge of what Brenda deemed the common space. The common space, in Sycamore Creek Estates, was a nebulous concept, a strip of grass separating driveways, a buffer zone that existed primarily in the minds of the HOA board, and especially in the mind of Brenda Henderson. It was where the annual Easter egg hunt was held, where the rogue tennis balls from the community courts occasionally landed, and apparently, where my petunias were encroaching. The flamingo incident was merely the prelude. The main act arrived on a sweltering Thursday afternoon. I was home, enjoying a rare moment of quiet. The hum of the air conditioner a comforting drone when I heard the unmistakable crunch of tires on gravel. Brenda's pristine white SUV, a vehicle as immaculate as its owner, pulled up to the curb. She emerged, a vision in pale blue linen, her silver hair pulled back in a severe bun, her expression one of grim determination. She walked directly towards my mailbox, her movements precise and deliberate. In her hands, she carried a roll of bright orange caution tape. My heart sank. I knew, with a chilling certainty, what was about to happen. She didn't even knock. She didn't call out to me. She simply proceeded to wrap the tape, taut and unforgiving, around the base of my mailbox post, creating an impassable barrier. It was a declaration of war, a public shaming, A blatant act of defiance against the simple act of receiving my mail. I watched from my living room window, a knot of anger and disbelief tightening in my stomach. The orange tape glowed like a warning sign, a beacon of Brenda's indignation. It felt absurd, surreal, like a scene from a particularly petty dystopian novel. "What in the actual hell?" I muttered, my voice barely a whisper. The mail carrier, a cheerful man named Dave, who always had a friendly word, was due any minute. I pictured his confusion, his frustration, as he encountered this garish barricade. I took a deep breath, trying to quell the rising tide of panic. This couldn't be happening. This was a neighborhood, not a maximum security prison. I grabbed my phone and dialed the HOA president, a man named Mr. Abernathy, who was generally amiable but prone to being swayed by the more assertive members of his board. Brenda, no doubt, was the most assertive. "Hello?" Mr. Abernathy's voice was a little muffled, as if he were speaking from inside a pillow. "Mr. Abernathy, it's Sarah Miller at 12 Oak Street," I began, my voice a little shaky. I need your help. Brenda Henderson she's taped off my mailbox." There was a pause on the other end. "Taped off your mailbox?" "What do you mean, Sarah?" "She's put caution tape around the post," I explained, gesturing wildly at the window. "She says my flowers are encroaching on common space." Another, longer pause. I could practically hear him sighing. "Brenda is very passionate about the community guidelines, Sarah. Perhaps you could trim back your roses." "Trim them back? Mr. Abernathy, she's blocked my access to my mail. I can't get my mail. This is ridiculous." My voice was rising, the frustration bubbling over. "I understand your concern, Sarah, but I'll have to speak with Brenda. I'm sure we can resolve this amicably." Amicably. The word hung in the air, hollow and unconvincing. I knew Brenda. Amicably was not in her vocabulary when it came to matters of perceived rule-breaking. I hung up the phone, feeling a cold dread settle over me. This was just the beginning. The scent of honeysuckle, once a comfort, now felt like a suffocating shroud. The war for my mailbox had officially begun, and I had a sinking feeling that Brenda Henderson was a formidable and utterly unreasonable adversary. My little patch of colorful chaos had apparently crossed a line in the meticulously ordered world of Sycamore Creek Estates, and the consequences were proving to be far more significant than a few stray rose branches. The next morning dawned, not with the gentle, sun-drenched optimism I usually associated with summer, but with a low-grade hum of anxiety that vibrated beneath my skin. The air, usually thick with the sweet, almost cloying perfume of honeysuckle and the fainter, more delicate notes of my impatiens and petunias, felt heavy, charged with an unspoken threat. I peered through my kitchen window, the pristine white of Brenda Henderson's meticulously manicured lawn, a stark, accusatory rectangle against the softer, more organic lines of my own property. And there it was, a garish, neon beacon of Brenda's indignation. The bright orange caution tape stretched taut across the front of my black metal mailbox. It was a declaration of war, a petty, suburban war, waged with plastic and adhesive tape, but a war nonetheless. My mail, my lifeline to the outside world, my connection to bills, junk mail, maybe even a postcard from my sister who was traveling through Europe, utterly, infuriatingly inaccessible. I'd woken up with a knot in my stomach, the weight of Mr. Abernathy's placid, unhelpful response from yesterday still settling. "I'll have a word with Brenda," he'd said, his voice as bland and unmemorable as a piece of unbuttered toast. I could practically hear him sighing, already picturing the inevitable conversation where Brenda would unleash her carefully curated storm of grievances, and he would nod along, eager to avoid any actual conflict. He was the HOA president, But Brenda was the de facto ruler of Sycamore Creek Estates, her iron will disguised as a dedication to neighborhood harmony. I pulled on my gardening gloves, the familiar comfort of the worn leather doing little to soothe my frayed nerves. Stepping out onto my porch, I could feel the oppressive stillness of the morning. Even the birds seemed to be chirping with a muted, hesitant cadence. As I approached my mailbox, the vibrant orange tape seemed to pulse with an almost malevolent energy. It was more than just a barrier. It was a symbol. A symbol of Brenda's suffocating need for control, her inability to tolerate anything that deviated from her own narrow definition of perfection. My climbing roses, the velvety crimson beauties that I'd nurtured from spindly cuttings, were the alleged culprits. Their tendrils, laden with dew-kissed blooms, had undeniably stretched, reaching out like affectionate, albeit slightly overzealous, fingers. They'd brushed against the edge of the common space, that nebulous strip of grass that Brenda seemed to police with the vigilance of a border patrol agent. I'd always considered that patch of grass a mere suggestion, a fuzzy boundary line that blurred into the natural flow of my garden. Brenda, it seemed, viewed it as sacred ground, a line drawn in the sand that, once crossed, unleashed her fury. I reached out, my gloved fingers brushing against the sticky plastic. I could easily pull it down, yank it free, and reclaim my mailbox. But I knew, with a chilling certainty, that this was just the opening salvo. Brenda wouldn't let it go. She'd escalate. She had a history. Last year, it was Mrs. Gable's slightly too tall azaleas. The year before, the garish flock of plastic flamingos that had briefly graced the lawn of the new family on Elm Street. They'd moved within 6 months, and I suspected Brenda's subtle campaign of psychological warfare had played a significant role. I took a deep breath, the sweet scent of my roses mingling with the acrid tang of my own rising frustration. This wasn't about roses. This was about power. Brenda's power, and my perceived lack of it. She saw my garden, with its wild explosions of color and its gentle, untamed spirit, as an affront to her own rigidly controlled existence. My mailbox, a utilitarian object, had become the latest battleground. Just then, I heard the familiar crunch of tires on gravel. Brenda's pristine white SUV, a gleaming monument to her dedication to all things immaculate, glided silently into her driveway. She emerged, dressed in a pale blue linen outfit that looked as if it had been ironed by a laser. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a severe, impossibly neat bun. She spotted me standing by my mailbox, and a slow, self-satisfied smile spread across her face. It was the smile of a predator who knew she had her prey cornered. She didn't approach, of course. Brenda never engaged directly when she had the upper hand. Instead, she stood on her porch, arms crossed, a statuesque embodiment of righteous indignation. I could practically feel her thoughts radiating across the manicured expanse separating us. "See, I told you, you broke the rules, and now you can't even get your mail." I walked back towards my house, the orange tape mocking me with every step. This was absurd. Utterly, ridiculously absurd. I was being denied access to my own mailbox because of a few errant rose tendrils. It felt like a scene ripped from a poorly written, petty dystopian novel. I needed a plan. I couldn't just let Brenda win. This was more than just about my roses or my mail. It was about the principle of the thing. It was about the creeping sense of unease that Brenda's reign of terror had instilled in our neighborhood, turning what should be a welcoming community into a landscape of fear and conformity. My first thought was to call the post office. Surely they had rules about mailboxes being blocked. I pictured Dave, my usual mail carrier, a cheerful man whose daily greetings were a small, bright spot in my routine. What would he do? Would he leave a notice? Would he just skip my house altogether? The thought sent a fresh wave of panic through me. I grabbed my phone, my fingers hovering over the contacts. Then I remembered Mr. Abernathy. He was the president. He was supposed to be the one who handled these things. But his passive reaction had been disheartening. He was clearly afraid of Brenda, or at least unwilling to confront her. That left me, Sarah Miller, armed with nothing but a slightly overgrown garden and a growing sense of righteous fury. I decided to document everything. I took a few photos of the taped-off mailbox, the orange tape stark against the weathered metal. I zoomed in on the offending rose branches, trying to capture just how little they actually encroached on anything substantial. I even took a wide shot, showing the immediate vicinity of the mailbox, the clear path that should have been there. Evidence. That's what I needed. Evidence to present to someone, anyone, who might actually listen. As I was framing another shot, I saw movement at the end of Brenda's driveway. Her husband, Gerald, a quiet man who mostly seemed to exist in Brenda's shadow, was emerging from their garage. He was holding a small, brightly colored flag. A for sale sign flag, perhaps? No. It looked more like a decorative garden flag, something Brenda would deem appropriate for her immaculate front yard. He walked towards the edge of their property, near the sidewalk that ran past our houses, and planted it firmly in the ground. It was a small, almost insignificant act, but it felt deliberate, another subtle territorial marking. Brenda's influence, it seemed, extended even to Gerald's gardening choices. I felt a surge of something akin to pity for Gerald, trapped in Brenda's meticulously curated world. But the pity was quickly overshadowed by a renewed sense of determination. This wasn't just about Brenda anymore. It was about reclaiming a sense of normalcy, of freedom in our neighborhood. It was about ensuring that a few overzealous rose bushes didn't become the catalyst for a full-blown HOA-induced breakdown. I decided my next step had to be more official. I couldn't just rely on Mr. Abernathy's vague promises. I needed to find the actual HOA bylaws, the rulebook that Brenda was so fond of wielding like a weapon. I remembered seeing a binder of them in the community center's small office, a dusty tome filled with legalese and obscure regulations. It was time to dive into the bureaucratic abyss. As I turned to go inside, I heard the distant rumble of Dave's mail truck approaching. My heart sank. He'd be here any minute. I braced myself, imagining his cheerful confusion, the inevitable awkwardness. I couldn't bear the thought of him being caught in the crossfire of Brenda's petty war. I had to do something. I had to find a way to get that tape down before he arrived. The threads that kept my mundane life from unraveling were starting to fray, and the thought of my mail being held hostage was, frankly, unbearable. It was time to fight back, one cautiously optimistic, yet deeply annoyed, step at a time. The bright orange tape stark against the muted gray of the black metal box felt like a physical blow. It wasn't just caution tape. It was a declaration of war. A garish plastic banner proclaiming Brenda Henderson's complete and utter dominion over my small patch of Sycamore Creek estates. My mailbox, my lifeline, and Brenda had sealed it shut. I stared, a cold dread seeping into my bones, replacing the earlier flicker of righteous indignation. This wasn't about a few errant rose tendrils brushing against a nebulous strip of grass. This was about control. It was about Brenda's meticulously manicured, suffocatingly perfect vision of suburban life, a vision that apparently excluded vibrant, living things that dared to grow with a mind of their own. The air, moments before thick with the cloying sweetness of honeysuckle and the distant hum of lawnmowers, suddenly felt thin, suffocating. The late afternoon sun, which had been casting long, golden shadows across my lawn, now seemed to mock me with its cheerful indifference. It illuminated the tape, highlighting its cheapness, its sheer audacity. What in the actual hell? My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. I'd called Mr. Abernathy, bless his amiable but utterly useless heart, and his response had been a masterclass in passive avoidance. "Just trim the roses, Sarah," he'd chirped, his voice an octave higher than usual, clearly desperate to end the conversation. "Brenda's very passionate about the common areas." Passionate? He made it sound like she was a devoted gardener, not a tyrannical overlord armed with garden shears and a terrifying knowledge of bylaws. I pictured Brenda, her pale blue linen dress immaculate, her silver hair pulled back in a severe bun, meticulously wrapping that tape. I imagined her humming a little tune, a satisfied smirk playing on her lips as she secured the final corner, a triumphant warrior claiming victory over a few defiant blooms. It was so Brenda. So utterly, absurdly Brenda. My gaze drifted to her house, a testament to her obsession. Her lawn was a geometric marvel, a carpet of impossibly green, uniformly cut blades. Her flower beds were edged with military precision, not a single petal out of place, not a weed daring to sprout. It was a landscape devoid of spontaneity, a sterile monument to conformity. And now, she'd extended her sterile reach to my mailbox. A car crunched on the gravel driveway across the street. Dave. My mail carrier. My beacon of normalcy. He was usually a cheerful, robust man, always with a friendly wave and a quick word about the weather or the latest neighborhood gossip. Today, he was the harbinger of my impending frustration. He pulled his truck to a stop in front of my house, a familiar, comforting ritual. He hopped out, his mailbag slung over his shoulder, and began his practiced walk towards my mailbox. Then he stopped. His eyebrows shot up, his usual smile faltering as he took in the bright orange declaration of Brenda's petty war. He approached cautiously, as if the tape might bite. He tilted his head, then tentatively reached out, his fingers hovering inches from the barrier. He looked at me, his expression a mixture of confusion and sympathy. Sarah? What's going on here?" His voice, usually so full of jovial energy, was tinged with bewilderment. I walked towards him, my heels sinking slightly into the soft grass. "Brenda happened, Dave," I said, my voice tight. "She decided my roses were encroaching." Dave chuckled, a nervous sound. "Encroaching on the common space, huh? Those roses are beautiful, Sarah. Always smell so good." He gestured towards the tape. "This is a bit much, isn't it?" "A bit much is an understatement, Dave. It's a blockade." I sighed, running a hand through my hair. Can you still deliver my mail?" Dave scratched his chin. "Well, technically the mailbox is inaccessible. My instructions are generally to leave mail at the box. If it's blocked..." He trailed off, clearly unsure of the protocol for such an extreme act of neighborly hostility. "I can't really shove it through the tape, can I?" My heart sank. "So, no mail today?" "Not unless I can get it in there," he said, giving the tape a dubious poke. "Maybe I can reach around." He tried, contorting his arm, but the tape was taut, and the mailbox opening was just out of his comfortable reach. He let out a small grunt of exertion. "Nope. Solidly taped. Brenda really went for it." He looked at me again, his gaze sympathetic. "Look, Sarah, I'm sorry. I'll have to mark this as undeliverable for today. You can pick it up at the post office tomorrow if you want. Or maybe this can get sorted out." He gave a pointed look towards Brenda's pristine house, where no sign of life was visible. "Thanks, Dave," I said, trying to muster a smile. "I appreciate you trying." He shrugged, a gesture that conveyed his helplessness in the face of Brenda's escalating madness. "Just doing my job." Hope it gets sorted soon. This is a first for me." He gave me another wave, a little less cheerful this time, and climbed back into his truck. The crunch of tires as he drove away sounded like the closing of a door, leaving me stranded with my besieged mailbox. Undeliverable. The word echoed in my mind. It was more than just letters and bills. It was the catalog I'd been waiting for, the new book I'd ordered, the confirmation for our weekend getaway. It was the threads that kept my mundane life from unraveling. And Brenda had just severed them with a roll of bright orange tape. I stood there for a long moment, the scent of honeysuckle suddenly feeling cloying, oppressive. My climbing roses, the very ones Brenda deemed a menace, now seemed to droop slightly, their velvety crimson petals catching the sunlight. They were a vibrant splash of life against Brenda's monochrome world, and I realized with a surge of defiance I wouldn't let her extinguish that. I turned back to the mailbox, my eyes narrowing. This wasn't going to stand. Mr. Abernathy was useless. Dave was bound by rules, but I was not. I had my own rules, and the primary one was that I wouldn't be bullied into submission by a neighbor with an unhealthy obsession with order. I walked back towards my house, my mind already churning with possibilities. I needed to document this. Photos. A written account. I glanced at Brenda's house again, a flicker of something akin to respect for her sheer audacity mixed with my rising anger. She was a force, albeit a petty, vindictive one. As I reached my front door, I heard the distinct sound of a car door slamming shut, followed by the crunch of tires on gravel. Not Dave's truck. This was a heavier vehicle. A pristine white SUV, the kind that screamed expensive and meticulously maintained, pulled into the driveway across the street, parking with an almost militant precision. And then, the driver's side door opened, and Brenda Henderson emerged, her silver hair gleaming, her pale blue linen dress a stark contrast to the vibrant chaos she was determined to eradicate. She carried a small, leather-bound book and a pen. She was clearly here to inspect her handiwork. My heart pounded. This was it. The next act in this ridiculous, petty dystopian novel. She was coming to admire her handiwork, to bask in the glow of her perceived victory. I knew, with a certainty that chilled me, that this was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. I needed to be strategic. I needed to be smart. And I needed to make sure that Brenda Henderson knew, in no uncertain terms, that she had picked the wrong mailbox to tape off. Brenda stood on the sidewalk, a beacon of Brenda's indignation, arms crossed over her impeccably pressed pale blue linen blouse. Her gaze, sharp and unwavering, swept over the offending roses, then flicked to the bright orange tape plastered across my black metal mailbox. It looked like a rash, a garish blight on the otherwise orderly tapestry of our neighborhood. The tape, emblazoned with caution, was Brenda's proclamation, her declaration of war, and it was directed squarely at me. A faint, almost imperceptible smirk played on her lips as she surveyed the scene, a testament to her victory. The sun, which had been a warm, benevolent presence just moments before, suddenly felt like an interrogator's spotlight, illuminating my humiliation. The air, thick with the cloying sweetness of honeysuckle, seemed to press in, suffocating me with its manufactured pleasantness. This was not the gentle, fragrant banner of summer I usually associated with Sycamore Creek Estates. This was the smell of impending doom, of petty dystopian novels brought to life by a woman with too much time and an unwavering belief in her own rigid righteousness. I stood on my porch, a safe distance away, my hands clenched into fists. My meticulously manicured climbing roses, their velvety crimson blooms a riot of color against the weathered wood of my trellis, seemed to droop in silent protest. They had, Brenda claimed, encroached on common space. The common space. That nebulous concept, a mere sliver of neglected grass between driveways, was Brenda's personal battlefield, and my roses, in their exuberant, life-affirming growth, had dared to cross its invisible, imaginary border. Dave, bless his cheerful, oblivious heart, had already come and gone. I'd watched from my window as he'd approached my mailbox, his canvas bag slung over his shoulder, whistling a jaunty tune. When he'd seen the tape, his whistling had faltered, replaced by a quizzical frown. He'd circled the mailbox, peered at the tape, then, with a sigh that I felt in my own chest, had attached a small red flag to the handle, a harbinger of returned mail. He'd shaken his head, a silent acknowledgement of the absurdity, before moving on to the next house, the next perfectly manicured lawn. Undeliverable. The word echoed in my mind, a stark pronouncement of my ostracization. Brenda, meanwhile, seemed to be enjoying her moment. She adjusted her designer sunglasses, the lenses reflecting the perfectly pruned hedges of her own yard, a stark contrast to the wild, untamed beauty of mine. Her house, a monument to her obsession with control, was a symphony of beige and perfectly aligned shutters. Not a single leaf dared to stray from its designated spot. Her lawn was a geometrically perfect carpet, her flower beds edged with military precision. It was the antithesis of my own patch of earth, which I considered a living, breathing explosion of life. Having trouble, Sarah? Brenda's voice, smooth as polished marble, cut through the humid air. It wasn't a question. It was a taunt. I took a deep breath, trying to channel the calm I usually felt when tending to my garden. My mail is being returned, Brenda. My voice was steady, though my insides churned with a potent cocktail of indignation and disbelief. She shrugged, a subtle, dismissive gesture. Well, that's unfortunate. Perhaps if certain residents were more mindful of the community guidelines, such inconveniences could be avoided. She gestured vaguely towards my roses with a perfectly manicured hand. Those roses, they're quite vigorous. They're climbing roses, Brenda. That's what they do, and they're on my property. I pointed to the sturdy trellis that supported their sprawling branches. Technically, she purred, stepping closer, her pristine white SUV parked strategically at the curb as if to emphasize her arrival. They are encroaching on the common space. The bylaws are quite clear about landscaping exceeding property lines, even by a few inches. It's about maintaining a consistent aesthetic for Sycamore Creek Estates. A consistent aesthetic of what, Brenda? Of repression? Of stifling any sign of life or color that doesn't fit your narrow definition of perfection. My voice had risen, the carefully constructed calm beginning to fray. She tilted her head, her expression unreadable behind her dark lenses. I'm merely enforcing the rules, Sarah. Rules that we all agreed to when we purchased our homes here. It's for the good of the community. The good of the community? Or the good of your own desperate need for control? The words were out before I could stop them. Brenda's smile vanished. Her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. I see you're choosing to be difficult. Mr. Abernathy did suggest you trim them back. Mr. Abernathy suggested I trim them. He didn't suggest you tape off my mailbox with caution tape like some sort of biohazard. The bright orange tape seemed to mock me, a symbol of how absurdly my life had become entangled with Brenda's rigid agenda. It's a temporary measure, she said, her tone hardening. Until the offending foliage is dealt with. I'm sure Dave will understand. He's a professional. Dave can't deliver my mail if he can't access the mailbox, Brenda. That's not a matter of understanding. It's a matter of physics and postal regulations. I could feel the heat rising in my cheeks. This was beyond ridiculous. I was arguing with my neighbor about a few inches of rose bush and a roll of caution tape. She took a step back, a subtle victory in her posture. Well, I've done my part. I've alerted the necessary parties to the situation. I'm sure the board will be making a formal inquiry soon. The board. That nebulous entity that seemed to exist solely to rubber stamp Brenda's every whim. Mr. Abernathy, bless his amiable but utterly ineffective soul, was the president. But Brenda was the de facto queen, ruling Sycamore Creek Estates with an iron fist clad in a floral gardening glove. You know, I said, a dangerous calm settling over me, I've been doing some reading myself, about the bylaws, and about common space. It's fascinating how subjective it all is, especially when it comes to things like landscaping. Brenda's eyes narrowed. I'm not sure I understand what you're implying, Sarah. I'm implying, Brenda, that perhaps your interpretation of common space and consistent aesthetic is a little overzealous. And I'm also implying that taping off a resident's mailbox might be a tad outside the scope of what the HOA bylaws allow for a dispute about rose bushes. She scoffed, a sharp, brittle sound. You're welcome to consult the bylaws. I'm confident you'll find my actions are entirely within reason. We'll see about that, I said, my voice laced with a newfound resolve. This was no longer just about flowers. This was about a fundamental right to receive my mail, about the absurdity of a suburban dictatorship, and about the sheer, unadulterated gall of Brenda Henderson. She gave a curt nod, a final, dismissive gesture, and turned. Her perfectly coiffed blonde hair gleamed in the sunlight as she walked back to her pristine white SUV. The crunch of her expensive sandals on the pavement was a percussive punctuation mark to her departure. As she opened the car door, she glanced back, her expression unreadable, before sliding in and pulling away with smooth, practiced ease. The hum of her air conditioner, a stark mechanical sound, faded down the street, leaving me alone with my taped-off mailbox and the suffocating scent of honeysuckle. The orange tape, stark and unforgiving, seemed to pulse in the afternoon sun. It was a physical manifestation of Brenda's obsession, a gaudy declaration of her petty tyranny. But as I looked at it, a flicker of something other than frustration ignited within me. It was a spark of defiance. Brenda thought she had won. She thought she had silenced me, isolated me, made me concede. But she had underestimated the power of a woman who had had enough. She had underestimated the lengths to which I would go to get my mail, and more importantly, to push back against her suffocating control. This wasn't just about my roses anymore. This was a battle for the soul of Sycamore Creek Estates, and Brenda had just handed me the ammunition. I would gather evidence, I would consult the bylaws, and I would fight this. The war over the mailbox had just begun. The bright orange tape, stretched taut and garish against the muted tones of my mailbox, felt like a personal insult. It wasn't just tape. It was a declaration of war, Brenda's gaudy banner of petty tyranny. I stood on my driveway, the summer heat radiating off the asphalt in shimmering waves, staring at the violation. Dave, my usually cheerful mail carrier, had left a note tucked under my windshield wiper. Sorry, Sarah, can't deliver to this box with the tape. Brenda said it's a violation. Leave a note if you need something urgent. Leave a note? My lifeline to the outside world, my connection to bills, packages, and the occasional much-needed Amazon dopamine hit, was severed by a roll of fluorescent plastic. A shiver, entirely unrelated to the heat, traced its way down my spine. Brenda Henderson. The name itself was becoming a curse, a harbinger of annoyance and soul-crushing control. Her house, a testament to her obsession with sterile perfection, was a mere 2 doors down, its lawn a geometrically flawless emerald carpet, its flower beds edged with military precision. Not a single weed dared to sprout in Brenda's meticulously curated domain, My own yard, a riot of color and gentle sway, a living, breathing explosion of life, was clearly an affront to her sensibilities. My climbing roses, a cascade of velvety crimson that had taken years to cultivate, were the current victims of her horticultural vendetta. A few errant tendrils, reaching for the sun with the innocent abandon of nature, had allegedly encroached on the nebulous concept of common space, that sliver of grass between driveways that existed primarily in the fevered imagination of the HOA board, particularly Brenda. I'd tried reason. I'd tried diplomacy. I'd even tried ignoring her until she'd escalated from passive-aggressive notes about my unruly garden to full-blown acts of vandalism. The plastic flamingos had been a warning shot, a garish flock of judgment placed strategically around my mailbox, as if to say, "Your whimsical nature is not welcome here." I'd removed them, of course, but their brief, absurd reign had only fueled Brenda's resolve. Now this, the tape, it was a bold move, even for her. My mind raced, a whirlwind of indignation and disbelief. What in the actual hell was I supposed to do? Drive to the post office every day to pick up my mail? This wasn't just inconvenient, it was a deliberate act of harassment. I pictured Brenda, her face a mask of righteous fury, wielding that roll of tape like a weapon, carefully securing it to the metal box, her movements precise and deliberate, each rap a testament to her unwavering commitment to enforcing her personal brand of order onto the world. I could almost hear the triumphant click of the tape dispenser, the satisfied sigh of a job well done. I pulled out my phone, my thumb hovering over Mr. Abernathy's contact. He was the HOA president, a man whose primary skill seemed to be his ability to delegate any actual decision-making to Brenda. I'd spoken to him earlier, after the flamingo incident. He'd listened with a vaguely sympathetic hum, his voice a gentle murmur, before suggesting, in that way of his, that perhaps a little trim of the rose bushes would smooth things over. He'd sounded less like an HOA president, and more like a man trying to placate a particularly irate toddler. "Sarah, hello?" His voice, when he finally answered, was as smooth and unruffled as his perfectly manicured lawn. "Mr. Abernathy, it's Sarah Miller. Brenda has taped off my mailbox." The words felt absurd as I said them, like something out of a particularly absurd episode of a suburban sitcom. A beat of silence. Then, "Oh dear. Brenda has she? That's unexpected." His voice was laced with a practiced neutrality that made my teeth ache. "Unexpected? Mr. Abernathy, it's tape! Bright orange caution tape." "It's blocking my mail delivery." My voice, despite my best efforts, had ratcheted up a few octaves. "Yes, I understand, Sarah. She mentioned something about the roses. Encroaching, I believe, was the term she used. On the common space." He paused, as if waiting for me to acknowledge the gravity of such an offense. "The common space? Mr. Abernathy, my roses are beautiful. They're a joy to look at, and a few tendrils are hardly a violation worthy of restricting my mail delivery." The rage was starting to bubble, a hot, unpleasant sensation in my chest. "Well, Brenda is very particular about the aesthetic of Sycamore Creek Estates," Mr. Abernathy offered, his tone conciliatory. "She feels very strongly about maintaining the appearance of the neighborhood. And you know, the bylaws are quite clear about common spaces." "The bylaws are clear about common spaces?" "Yes," I retorted, my mind already flipping through the dog-eared copy of the HOA bylaws I kept on my bookshelf. "They are also clear about the obstruction of mail delivery, and I'm fairly certain Brenda's interpretation of encroachment is a bit creative." "Perhaps, Sarah, if you could just trim those few errant branches," he suggested, the same tired refrain. "It would be the simplest solution. Avoid any further